Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate that you're all here for this talk on Strudel Media Live. This event is part of our series Vantage Points. And today, Bonnie Yochelson will talk about the work of photographer Margaret Morton. And after her presentation, Bonnie will be in conversation with Sean Corcoran, who is the senior curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York. Thanks again for joining. I'm Anja Hitzenberger from StrudelmediaLive. For those of you who are new to us, we offer live online photography classes. We have a scholarship program. We organize photo talks, and in case you want to watch any past talks, you can do so on our Strudel Media Live YouTube channel. I want to thank Bonnie and Sean for being here today, and I want to give you a little bit of information about both of them. Bonnie Yochelson is a former curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, and she has written books on many New York photographers, including Bernice Abbott, Jacob Riis, Alfred Stieglitz, and most recently, Alice Austin. And Bonnie taught for 30 years in the Department of Photography, Video, and Related Media at the School of Visual Arts. And she's currently the executive director of the Margaret Morton Archive. And Sean is the senior curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York. And he previously served as assistant curator of photography at George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. And the exhibitions he curated included Through a Different Lens, Stanley Kubrick photographs, Above Ground art from the Martin Wong graffiti collection, and Robert Rauschenberg's New York, Pictures from the Real World, and others. And he has written extensively on photography and graffiti and contributing to more than 24 publications. And now I want to welcome our speakers, Bonnie Yochelson and Sean Corcoran. And Bonnie, I'm turning it over to you if you want to say hello and give an introduction. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anja, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that so many people are here. Let me start with a brief explanation of who Margaret Morton was and how today's presentation came about. I should preface my remarks with a disclaimer that I am presenting an illustrated lecture with a prepared script. I do this not because I am a formal person, but rather the opposite. When I speak extemporaneously, I digress a lot. So to assure that we have enough time for a discussion, I found it best to present this way. So please feel free, I want to reiterate Anja's exhortation to please put whatever questions you might have about Margaret or me or the archive in the chat. Let's put up the title slide, Steph, for the talk. And I'll begin. Margaret Morton is best known for her extensive documentation of the homeless crisis in New York in the 1990s. She photographed and interviewed residents of homeless communities from 1989, when encampments began to proliferate, until 1997, when city authorities forcibly removed all the encampments from the streets. Margaret exhibited her photographs widely, but her medium of choice was the book, which allowed her to combine the photographs with excerpts from interviews of the people portrayed. She published 4 books between 1993 and 2004. I'm a photography curator by trade and was a friend of Margaret's from 1990 until she died in 2020. Years earlier, she asked me to be the executor of her estate to help save her work. To that end, I established the Margaret Morton Archive in 2022. Although the archive's primary goal is to arrange donations of her work to public collections, last year we organized an exhibition in collaboration with Interference Archive in Brooklyn. At the end of the run of the show in January, I gave a talk about Margaret's life and work. Anja, who's a friend and colleague of our archivist, Stephanie Neal, attended. So here we are. I reached out to Sean Corcoran, curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, to be my interlocutor. Years ago, I was Sean's predecessor in his job, which he has now held for 20 years. He knows Margaret's work, and he knew Margaret too. We are discussing a possible donation to the museum, so it was natural for me to ask him to join us today. So let me return to Margaret's story. Next slide. Margaret Willis was born in 1948 in Akron, Ohio. She grew up in Cuyahoga Falls, a small Ohio city, and attended Kent State University. She was a senior at Kent State in 1970 when National Guardsmen opened fire and killed students protesting the Vietnam War. After graduation, she married her high school boyfriend, Tom Morton, who had attended Dartmouth College. Tom enlisted in the Navy, and the young couple moved to Italy, where Tom was stationed for 3 years. And this shows them on their departure to Italy. The couple traveled extensively in Italy and to major European cities, Tom envisioning a career in architecture and Margaret in graphic design. In 1975, they both entered graduate school at Yale University. Yale's graphic design department was renowned, including leading modernist designers Alvin Eisenman, Paul Rand, Norman Ives, and Armin Hoffman. Margaret's Yale experience was transformative, establishing her understanding of graphic design as a calling. She modeled her career on her mentors by pursuing her own work as a fine artist while teaching and seeking commercial opportunities as a graphic designer. Margaret's painting remained rooted in her Italian experience, consisting of female figures based on Renaissance models and abstractions inspired by architectural form and theory. Next slide shows one of these works, the works based on Italian Renaissance painting, and the next shows one of the abstract works based on architectural form. In 1977, Tom was hired by Cesar Paley, who that year opened his own firm, having won the competition for the expansion of the Museum of Modern Art. Also in 77, Paley was appointed dean of the Yale School of Architecture. He and his wife, Diana Balmori, a landscape architect who also taught at Yale, took Margaret and Tom under their wing. Margaret rented studio space from Paley, and one of her paintings hung in the entrance of his Chapel Street office. And the next slide shows some pictures of Margaret in her studio in New Haven. Margaret and Tom rented a house in Branford on Long Island Sound, where the Paleys lived. Until 1984, Margaret lectured at Yale Summer School and at Cooper Union, commuting between New Haven and New York. In 1985, she was asked to start a graphic design program at Cooper and earned a tenure-track position there. She and Tom moved to New York and bought an apartment on the fourth floor of a tenement, which Tom renovated. In the mid-1990s, they separated and eventually divorced. Promoted to full professor in 1999, Margaret taught until her retirement in 2018. One of her classes, two-dimensional design, which was required of all first-year art students, defined what an artist should be for many Cooper students. And her Art of the Book class, which generated an annual exhibition, was legendary. And these are some of among the flyers for those Art of the Book class exhibitions. So Margaret and I met in 1990, and we were friends for 30 years. But everything I have just told you about her, I learned only after she died. We were bound together by mutual admiration for each other's work, but she had many friends closer to her than me. I did not know, for example, that Morton was her married name, and although I knew she was divorced, I didn't realize she was married for more than 20 years. I didn't know she taught graphic design. I assumed she taught photography, which she did occasionally. She asked me to visit her class several times, and I had no idea that she had devoted years to painting and drawing. So let me explain how Margaret became a photographer and how I became the executor of her estate. In 1990, I was curator of prints and photographs at the Museum of the City of New York, and Margaret invited me to an exhibition at 55 Mercer, an artist cooperative in Soho, where she was a member. This was her first exhibition of photographs depicting the tent-like structures adorned with found objects that were built by people living on the streets on the Lower East Side. I loved the work, and the museum acquired 9 prints. Although I was working in a history museum, like Margaret, I was an art person. I had a PhD in modern art history from NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, and I worked in the print rooms of several major art museums. At the Museum of the City of New York, I had my sights set on two of its most important collection of photographs. Bernie Sabbath's Changing New York, a landmark project of the Depression era, and the photographs of Jacob Riis, a social reformer of the 1890s who used the camera to reveal the inhumane conditions of the city's overcrowded tenements of that time. The connection between Margaret's photographs of the 1990 housing crisis and Riis's photographs of the 1890s housing crisis was obvious. Less obvious, but apparent to me, was Margaret's similarities to Abbott. Two Ohio-born women, both idealistic and ambitious artists, formally astute and technically perfectionistic, who put themselves at considerable physical risk to photograph the city's built environment. Margaret and I shared a passion for New York and a stubborn attachment to our work. I eventually wrote complete catalogs of the Abbott and Riis collections, and Margaret devoted 15 years to her New York photographs of the homeless crisis, publishing 4 books. So what led Margaret to pick up the camera and leave painting behind? Her address played a big part in it. Margaret and Tom's apartment was at 311 East 10th Street, a building at the north end of Tompkins Square Park, which was a short walk from Cooper Union. Around the time they moved in, homeless people began living in the park, which covered several square city blocks. By the summer of 1988, there were about 150 people living in a tent city there. In August, Mayor Ed Koch tried to impose a midnight curfew, but neighborhood supporters of the encampment protested and a riot broke out between protesters and police. Video footage shows that the police instigated the riot and the police commissioner apologized, a high point for the protest movement. Margaret was not in New York in August 1988, but when she came home, she found herself at the epicenter of a political maelstrom of national importance. As her archive reveals, she became a student of the housing crisis in her neighborhood, collecting protest announcements and clippings from local newspapers. She found her way into the subject through photography, which she had studied at Yale with Herbert Matter, a Swiss-born artist best known for incorporating photocollage into commercial design. Margaret's long-standing interest in architecture initially drew her to document the structures assembled from objects found on the streets. To photograph these structures, she asked permission of their owners and established relationships with them. Her network of contacts within this community grew, and in 1991, when Mayor David Dinkins closed Tompkins Square Park for a 2-year renovation, she followed many park residents to nearby vacant lots, which in turn led her to other homeless communities throughout Manhattan. While the interiors of these handmade structures served as shelter, the exteriors were highly ornamented assemblages that expressed the creativity and identity of their makers. By photographing these structures and getting to know their owners, Margaret came to consider them not just tents, but homes with gardens. Because they were constructed on public land, they were inevitably destroyed by the police, which led their owners to move and build again, sometimes in the same location. Nathaniel's tent and garden in Tompkins Square Park was destroyed in 14-degree weather on December 14th, 1989. He returned to the park and built another home pictured here, which was destroyed on June 3rd, 1991, when the park closed for renovation. James's garden is an example of a park residence rebuilding in an empty lot, nearby lot, this one on 9th Street. James and his housemates were artists, and they built a garden in front of their tent that was both menacing, note the rifle with the mannequin's head perched on top, and whimsical. Margaret's encounter with Jimmy, who constructed a tent, a garden, and a pond on an empty lot at Norfolk and Broome Streets, dramatically captures the essentials of her project. The pond was separate from his tent and vegetable garden, which can be seen in the back of the lot against a building. To construct the pond, Jimmy assembled stones, garbage bags, 5 tires, an upholstered armchair, a skid, a refrigerator shelf, a wooden fence, and a metal post. He filled the pond with water carried from a fire hydrant down the street and purchased goldfish to inhabit it. To protect the goldfish, which were often stolen by kids, he'd begun to build another pond closer to his tent. In her photograph, Margaret shows Jimmy fully enjoying his domain. 8 days later, when Margaret returned to photograph Jimmy again, the lot had been bulldozed and Jimmy had disappeared. The impermanence of these dwellings and the desire to document them created a sense of urgency in Margaret. The idea of a book began to form, which she initially called The Architecture of Despair. Wishing to allow those she photographed to tell their own stories, she recorded their conversations and asked them to sign releases for use of their image and words. In the mid-1990s, in addition to teaching and working tirelessly in the field, she produced her first two books. In 1993, she and Diana Belmori co-authored Transitory Gardens, Uprooted Lives. And in 1995, she published The Tunnel. Although Margaret and Tom separated at this time for reasons unrelated to her work, the person she was becoming was very different from the Navy wife Tom married in 1970. I believe that Transitory Gardens was Belmori's idea. The book is theoretical as well as descriptive. It is organized thematically by garden types, and many of the photographs are shown as figure illustrations, not full page. At the time, Margaret had little confidence in herself as a writer and was no doubt thrilled to collaborate with a respected scholar and mentor who could easily approach Yale University Press. For Belmori, Margaret's photographs presented new and challenging ideas about the very definition of gardens. In the introduction, she noted that garden history belongs to those with wealth and leisure. Belmori writes, while our book records the gardens of New York City inhabitants who, to say the least, have neither wealth nor leisure at their disposal, who have built simple gardens for themselves and have devoted time to them, it also represents a new way to consider the power of gardens. In the reuse of nearly everything discarded, the sparing use of water, and the economical treatment of space, these gardens speak the language of our time. We are admonished to recycle, to conserve, to make maximum use of scarce material resources. Here are these admonishments are heeded by necessity under extreme conditions, and the result is the elevation of such things as water and living plants to precious, valued elements. To us, these gardens seem a testimony to the essential need for a garden. Perhaps through them, we can learn again what a garden is. One of the gardens featured in the book is Anna's Garden, a wonderland of dolls and stuffed animals arrayed among ailanthus trees, hardy weeds that grew into trees throughout the city. The entire garden is surrounded by a tall chain link fence, and the only point of entry is at one corner blocked by a warning sign, "Beware of thieves." Upon close inspection, a trespasser could observe that the stuffed animals are intact, but all the dolls are damaged or broken, an idea Anna wished to represent, if only for herself. Anna constructed her garden on an abandoned lot, but she was not homeless. She lived in a building across the street. The persuasiveness of Belmori's thesis that these inventive structures built with scavenged materials were an innovative and instructive type of urban garden was affirmed by the fact that Wave Hill, a house museum that celebrated gardens, held an exhibition of Margaret's photographs. The Tunnel, published 2 years later, came about, I suspect, under duress. In the early 1980s, homeless people began moving into an abandoned railway tunnel that ran for 2.5 miles under Riverside Park from 72nd Street to 123rd Street. Except for shafts of light coming through grates from above, the residents lived in darkness, which provided some security from those who might do them harm, mostly teenage boys looking for trouble. The community went undetected until 1991, when Amtrak crews began laying new track for passenger service and discovered more than 50 people living in the tunnel. That year, Margaret met sociologist Terry Williams, who'd been doing field work in the tunnel, and who introduced her to Bernard Monty Isaac, who became her guide. The challenge of photographing in the tunnel was extreme. She used flash and did not see what she had photographed until her negatives were developed. Between 1991 and 1995, she often went into the tunnel weekly, spending hours after each visit in an Upper West Side coffee shop, gathering her thoughts by taking notes. Margaret's need to document the tunnel as quickly as possible came from Amtrak, which had announced that eviction was imminent. The need to publish came at least in part from a rival book. In 1993, Jennifer Toth published The Mole People, which became a bestseller. Toth had come to New York to attend Columbia School of Journalism, and the book was developed from her master's thesis. Margaret found Toth's book inaccurate and sensationalistic, and she was concerned that her own book would be overshadowed by it. By the time The Tunnel was published, Margaret was more established as an artist and author. She had a dealer, Simon Lewinsky, and Yale published the book. The Lewinsky exhibition of her photographs traveled to Germany, and the book was translated into German. This photograph of Margaret was taken by friend Fred Conrad for the New York Times, which published a long article about the tunnel photographs. I love this photograph because it captures Margaret's demeanor when she was intensely documenting homeless communities throughout the city. The Times did not publish it, but gave her a print, which I discovered when sorting through her papers. For many reasons, Margaret was averse to any publicity about her work that featured her. This is Bernard. With the tunnel, Margaret established the template for her subsequent two books. The photographs are printed full page, and the text, except for Margaret's brief factual introduction, are first-person accounts. Accompanying this photograph of Bernard, for example, are his reflections on living in the tunnel. This existence has done so much for me. It's taken me from my vanity. I had lived on the Upper West Side for 12 years, and for me to be in my neighborhood and just to adapt to the lifestyle of a homeless person, it's been remarkable that I've done it without shame. I've come in contact with some of the people that I have known over the years, prominent people in society, restaurant owners, producers, and choreographers, and they've been an inspiration to me because they say to me, well, your look is very different because you used to be very well groomed, a very flashy dresser. And now I'm looking at a different person, but I see that you are the same person. Bernard's stories about gathering food and cooking accompany this photograph of his kitchen. The other night, I was coming by Food Emporium on 90th and Broadway. Something just told me, take a peek in the dumpster because it just come out. And I opened up the lid and I uncovered 4 cans of salmon and lobster bisque, fresh broccoli, carrots, boxes of cookies. I mean, it was incredible stuff. I have always done most of the cooking, stews, soup. I love to cook. People say, that was amazing. I've never cooked professionally. I've never had a job as a cook. They thought I was in the military or something, which I wasn't. The text opposite this photograph of Bernard's tree reads, I envisioned that when I leave here, that I was going to leave something behind. I was eating a pear last week and it was very ripe. And I tore it open and there was a seed part and so I took a hole like a cavity and dug it out. I hope it grows. It's like to leave something like a plant or tree behind one day, probably return here and say, wow, my tree has grown. That would be great to see. Shortly after the book came out, tunnel residents were indeed forced to leave, and Margaret began working with Mary Brosnahan and Patrick Markey, leaders of the Coalition for the Homeless, to help residents into supportive housing. She continued this work for years. Notably, Patrick Markey recently published Placeless: Homelessness in the New Gilded Age, in which he discusses Margaret's photographs and her role as his intermediary with tunnel residents. By 1997, under the aggressive eviction policy of Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, all the encampments in Manhattan were cleared, signaling the end of Margaret's fieldwork. In the next few years, she focused on exhibitions and preparing the book she had originally envisioned that summarized the entire project. Renamed Fragile Dwelling, it was published by Aperture in 2000. The book presents an inventory of communities, beginning with those on the Lower East Side, which were featured in Transitory Gardens, plus the hill at the foot of the Manhattan Bridge, as well as encampments along the East and Hudson Rivers. She was now able to see her subjects in its entirety. The 1970s fiscal crisis, the chronic rise of homelessness, city government's alliance with real estate entrants to promote gentrification, and the harsh crackdown of the Giuliani administration, which pushed homeless people out of the security of their communities into the shadows. In Fragile Dwelling, Margaret's explanatory text was more extensive and she wrote more freely, allowing herself to become a character in the story. The book opens with a section on Bushville, a community of Puerto Rican men on the Lower East Side. She wrote, on East 4th Street, the building facades deteriorate with each step that takes me toward Avenue D. A few steps later, a large open space interrupts the unrelenting decay. A burst of salsa music reaches the street. On the right, a path leads to a cluster of pale blue and yellow casitas with wooden porches, gables, roofs, rock gardens, and statues of the Virgin Mary and St. Francis. String beans and squash vines climb a fence made from orange plastic bread trays. Rabbits and chicken poke through scraps of a noonday meal. She explains that the residents of Bushville came to New York from Puerto Rico with dreams of a better life. They lived and worked in the neighborhood, and 30 years later, having fallen on hard times, they stayed in the neighborhood, recreating on a vacant lot the village life of their youth. One of the residents she knew for several years was Pepe, a machinist who was disabled by an on-the-job accident. Pepe described coming to Bushville. I've been here since 1990. When I took over, there was nothing, only this room. A friend of mine started this house. That's why it's so low. I had to push it up 2 inches more. I put in a new beam, this one in the center. I had so many leaks, leaking all over. I did the rest of the house. I added the awning. I've improved it, and I'm going to improve it some more. Try to make it better for next winter. This photograph shows the house the following winter, much expanded. This photograph of Pepe in the winter of 1993 shows the interior of his home. The text describes the improvements he hoped to make the following summer. Shortly after Margaret took the photograph inside Pepe's home, Bushville was demolished, a scene she witnessed and describes. In the early morning hours of December 15th, 1993, Bushville was demolished. The residents were notified of the impending destruction but had nowhere else to go. As the bulldozers arrived, people quickly gathered their belongings. The noise of the heavy equipment was deafening as massive shovels wrenched the small houses from their foundations, held them high, and then hurled them to the ground. Everyone scattered, seeking temporary shelter in doorways, abandoned cars, or with friends, while their homes fell, splintered, piles of refuse once again. Along the Canal Street off-ramp of the Manhattan Bridge in Chinatown was a community known as the Hill. One of its residents was Mr. Lee, who, as Margaret explains, astonished his neighbors by constructing a house without pounding a nail or sawing a board. It was bound together with knots. The next photograph shows a detail of the knots. She continued, bright yellow plastic straps wrap his soft, rounded hut, binding old mattresses and bed springs into walls. The exterior is festooned with red bakery ribbons, paper lanterns, and cast-off calendars that celebrate the Chinese New Year. Oranges, symbols of prosperity, have hardened in the bitter cold and hang from the straps like ornaments. We then learn that Mr. Lee died in his home on May 29, 1992, in a fire set by an arsonist trying to get even with another resident. In the months that followed, every attempt to build on the site of Mr. Lee's house was destroyed by fire. After a rash of fires, the city demolished the Hill on August 17, 1993. In the late 1980s, a group of men from various parts of the city began building improvised dwellings along the seawall that borders the East River between the Manhattan and Brooklyn bridges. In 1992, when Margaret began going there, the population, which included girlfriends and pets, had grown to 35. Mac, the first slide was Mac's first house. This is a picture of Mac's second house. Mac built 2 houses on the East River, both photographed by Margaret. A bit of his story accompanies the photographs. I grew up in the South in a house that faced a river. I had a complete carpentry course in high school, but I improvise when I'm doing things here. I built this house in one day, really. When I started, I was just trying to keep it a refuge from the elements, and then I kind of reinforced it a little bit every now and then. You've got your basics, insulation and waterproofing. The location isn't soundproof, so you can hear the birds tweeting. Then Margaret explains, no one was prepared when the bulldozers came on July 1st, 1996. For those who considered this home, the dream was shattered. Everyone moved on. One of several West Side locations that Margaret explored was Pier 84, which jutted out into the Hudson River at West 44th Street. A group of 7 men built homes there, oblivious to the tourists who flocked to the site to visit the World War II aircraft carrier, the Intrepid, which was docked to the north of the pier, or to board the Circle Line to the south, which sponsored sightseeing boats around the island of Manhattan. One of these men was Angelo, who built a hut flanked by gardens, which were filled with children's toys. Although Margaret had to stoop to enter the 4-foot-high hut, the interior, she wrote, seemed to expand. Angelo explained to her how he became homeless. I've got a bad heart, high blood pressure. By the time I paid my medicine and $115 a week at a hotel in Coney Island, it left me nothing to eat. A friend of mine said, come to Pier 84 and put myself a house. Little by little, I made it a little bigger, a little bigger, a little bigger. In 2004, Margaret published one more book, A Portrait of Glass House. Her earlier books did not examine squatters who renovated and moved into abandoned buildings. This was the book featured in the exhibition at Interference Archive last fall. By the time Glass House was published, Margaret had moved on to her next project, and she did not spend time publicizing it. Glass House is my personal favorite, so it was a great pleasure to bring it to life at Interference Archive. I turned the project over to my staff of Stephanie Neal and Justin Hahn, who work collaboratively with the volunteers of Interference Archive. The exhibition and 4 programs achieved my intention of introducing Margaret's work to a younger audience concerned with the representation of social justice issues. It was a great show, and the programs were even better. Glass House was formerly the General Glass Industries Corporation, which consisted of 2 connected 5- and 6-story buildings at the corner of East 10th Street and Avenue D, just down the street from Margaret's apartment. In October 1992, a fire in a nearby squat called Fetus led many of its residents to move into the glass factory, expelling the drug dealers who were occupying it. Many residents were former runaways, and led by older squatters with construction skills, they cleared debris, hammered through concrete-covered window openings, repaired rotted joists, replaced much of the roof, and constructed rooms with building materials rescued from construction site dumpsters. Residency was restricted to members who earned a key to the building by showing that they had the ability and wherewithal to build their own living spaces. These are 2 residents in the kitchen of the house. Residents fetched water from a nearby fire hydrant and drew electricity from a street light. They installed a kitchen sink and 2 toilets, both emptying into buckets. They cooked on a wood-burning stove. When Margaret first visited in the fall of 1993, 38 people were living there. Margaret was especially interested in the governance of Glass House and was allowed to attend their Sunday meetings when rules were reviewed, chores assigned, and disputes discussed. Part of the book is devoted to portraits of individuals in their rooms with excerpts from their life stories. In their own way, each person expresses gratitude for living a glass house. The text opposite John's portrait reads, I'm 49. I was born in the Bronx. After my marriage broke up, I lived on 25th Street. In '88, I heard about the riots in Tompkins Square Park. I came down the next day, signed petitions, and got involved. In '89, I was living in Tent City near the fountain that said faith, hope, and charity. After they evicted us, I lived in squats, hallways, and subways. Then I was invited to live in Glass House. Callie was a rebellious child growing up in a chaotic home. She ran away when she was 13. Her attempts to live with relatives failed, and she often lived in the woods or on the streets. Her narrative ends this way. When I came to Glass House, I thought I had found a party that never ended. But when I was struggling to get off drugs, I realized that I had found people in my life who really cared. Before I started squatting, my mother didn't like the way I was. At first, she couldn't accept the way I acted, the way I dressed, my mohawk haircut, my body piercings. Now she knows how much pride I take in Glass House and how much I love the building and how much I put into it in the past 2 years. Now my mom comes and she hangs out with me and she does work days on the squat. She wants to be here with me as a friend, but not as a mother. On February 1st, 1994, the police and fire department entered Glass House and evicted the residents. Callie recalls, I saw all these fire trucks and all these police. The police were in riot gear and they looked really hateful. They were breaking down our front door with sledgehammers. You could tell that this was the end. They came up the stairs. They had semi-automatics. They said we had to leave. I had my puppies in my room and they said I couldn't take them. They were not even 2 weeks old. They shoved guns in our faces and said, leave. It's one more picture of Margaret's of their eviction. There's three of the residents of the house at the bottom with a sign that says Giuliani's answer to homeless winter evictions. Although Margaret's years devoted to this work radicalized her politics, I want to reiterate that the project developed organically without a political rationale. Addressing an audience of students in 1994, Margaret explained that she initially thought the Tompkins Square Park documentation would be the end of it, but it took her in directions she hadn't anticipated. She said, I think that's something I really like to pass on. If something starts to lead you in a direction that you hadn't planned, but it feels like the right thing to be doing, then you don't have to ask yourself a lot of questions about how does this fit in with my earlier work. I never looked back. I just went with this project and what it meant to me. I felt it was changing my life, and it had a big impact on my own person and how I related to people. This talk is about Margaret's documentation of New York's homeless communities, but let me simply mention the two major projects that followed. In the summer of 2002, Margaret accompanied her friend Verlana Shkach, director of Yara Arts Group, to document sites referenced in a Kyrgyz epic poem that Verlana planned to adapt as a theater production. On their 6 week journey into the mountains of Kyrgyzstan, Margaret encountered ancestral Islamic cemeteries that astonished her. From afar, they looked like miniature cities, but up close, they were half-human scale. She extended her trip to 10 weeks and returned 2 more times to document these miniature cities and to meet with scholars who taught her their history. These photographs became the subject of a book, Cities of the Dead, published in 2014 by Penn State University Press. This was Margaret's first body of work shot with a digital camera. In 2012, Margaret gained access to the 1.2 million square foot interior of the James A. Farley Post Office building, long abandoned by the thousands of postal workers who work there and in dilapidated condition. The Moynihan train hall on the first floor had been approved, but work had not yet begun. Wearing a hard hat and construction boots, Margaret wandered through this ruin in the heart of Midtown Manhattan. She wrote, I welcomed the solitude, the freedom to make discoveries and to imagine what once had been through what remained. Over the next several months, my exploration evolved into an excavation. This was Margaret's only photographic project in color, and I have one more picture from the series. This actually is a wall that shows the sort of pentimenti of filing cabinets on the wall and how the rug didn't darken where the filing cabinets were. For me, these photographs represent the synthesis of her documentation of the built environment with her formalist training at Yale. Margaret exhibited this work in the Postmaster General's office on the upper floor of the building and at the Architectural League of New York. She was working on a book, which sadly she did not finish. One last point of business, how I came to be Margaret's executor. Before she left for Kyrgyzstan in 2002, Margaret wrote her will and asked me if I would be her executor. Her greatest concern was preserving her work, a task she did not feel she could impose on her sister Judy in Ohio. As a photography curator, perhaps I could arrange donations to public collections. We both understood this was a heavy lift, but I agreed. I made it clear to her that I would need money to hire an archivist for several years. To that end, she left her Cooper Union pension to her estate, which was supplemented by the sale of her apartment. Margaret died unexpectedly in June 2020, shocking her family, her friends, and me. It took quite a while to be approved as executor, and in the meantime, I devised a plan to set up a temporary archive, admittedly something of an oxymoron. I rented space at Manor Contemporary in Jersey City, which houses many museum archives and artist studios, and I hired an outstanding staff. Our first donation consisted of Margaret's teaching papers, which now belong to the Cooper Union Library. We recently donated Margaret's camera equipment to Cooper, where darkroom technique is still taught. The Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. has agreed to accept Margaret's papers, which continued to yield surprises. And as I mentioned at the start, we are discussing a donation of the homeless work with the Museum of the City of New York. While donation is our primary goal, we spent much of last year on the Interference Archive exhibition and assisting the creative team of On the Spot NYC, a feminist history project that produces short videos on the life and work of New York women artists. Their piece on Margaret will be introduced at a program at Cooper Union in September, where 5 videos of women artists associated with the art school will be screened and discussed. This year, we are returning full-time to archival processing of the collection. Under Stephanie's supervision, we have begun to hire graduate students at the Pratt School of Information. We recently joined a Pratt Fellowship program in which we help subsidize the tuition of a student who devotes 1 day a week to us for the school year. And we have enlisted the expertise of Amina Lakhani, whose art advisory group will help us develop a plan to complete the task of dispersing Margaret's work. I think I speak for Stephanie and Justin as well as myself when I say that it's been a remarkable professional experience and an honor to secure Margaret's much-deserved legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. And I also want to thank Stephanie, who connected Bonnie and I. And Stephanie, also thank you for the technical aspect here of going from slide to slide. So, Sean, I will hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Bonnie. That's incredibly informative. I always pick up something I missed on a previous talk, so thanks for that. I was thinking maybe we could start with the content, or at least briefly talk about the content of Margaret's work first, and then delve into her Margaret as photographer and her context in photo history and art history. But I thought maybe thinking about the work in time first makes a lot of sense. And I don't know, maybe our audience here has gleaned the majority of the work with the homeless took place between 1988, just after the Tompkins Square Park riots, and about 95, maybe 96 at the furthest. Does that sound about right?
Yeah.
So it's really a short period of time, but in fact, from my perspective, it really bookends a moment in the city's history through the lens of a very specific issue and happening in the city. Um, and you know, Giuliani is definitely the villain in this, particularly at the end point, but it's really important to note that Dinkins was the mayor through most of this work. And so you get the end of Koch, the entire Dinkins term, and Giuliani, and buried in that is that all of this is happening at the end of a cycle of 20 years of financial mismanagement in the city and slow recovery and the efforts to bring the city back. One, I wanted your thoughts on just kind of like the work's place in the city's history. I know you're an art historian, but you had my position and you thought about the city's history quite a lot. So I know you have thoughts on it. But two, particularly as you and the team are going through Margaret's papers, I'm wondering how much she was aware, conscious of this kind of moment and the prehistory as she was doing the work. Was it in her mind, or did that come later maybe?
Well, we learned a lot about this in preparing the show for Interference Archive,
Mm,
which was an effort. The archive doesn't collect or show fine art, and
mm,
they collect ephemera and other materials about social, justice issues. So they had a pretty deep archive and the point of the show was to place her portrait of a squat in the
mm,
in basically political context, political and economic context.
mm,
So we all learned a tremendous amount, and then there's much of Margaret's own material that she collected that was in the exhibition as well, which is to say that I think that her point of entry here was architecture, which had been her
mm,
preoccupation. And then as she became more and more informed, and especially I think she basically identified with a lot of the people she photographs who should be in the sense that they were makers, and many of them had artistic sensibility if they weren't like artists per se. And so I think there was for her personally, um, which is something she did not speak about. This is when I knew her quite well, and we were very passionately involved in the same, subject matter. I'm really just giving you my overall sense as working with the archive and thinking about this much more now than I did then. But I think that I feel very strongly that she was not political. She was also not directly involved, but she was, of course, aware of the critical debate that was raging in the 90s among art critics and artists about the appropriateness of someone like Margaret, a Yale-trained, Ohio-born artist taking on the subject of what was then called the other, people who were, and she basically, most famously at the time for all students of art at that time was Martha Rosler's work, exhibition, and book about two inadequate description systems in which she photographed doorways of the Bowery without the homeless people sleeping in them because she felt it was inadequate, but it was morally correct to not photograph those people.
mm,
Um, eh, I won't go into it any further, but that had an enormous impact on the art community and the art critical community. And Margaret ignored it. I mean, she obviously thought about it, but as I read that quote in a talk she gave to an academic audience of art students, she said, I did what I had to do and it changed me. And again, also just as I say, I think her point of entry was architecture, but obviously became political as she got to know these people and to admire their accomplishments and to see how hard they worked to achieve what they did and then have it all destroyed because it was on public property and there were enormous social forces working toward cleaning up what was seen as a social problem and which was a social problem and but without a mindful strategy as to what would happen to the people who are displaced, rather a concern with cleaning up the city, selling properties to developers, and
mm,
gentrifying.
mm,
In terms of and I think little by little that she came to understand that big picture. I think she was really hit hard at first by just the sense of destruction that she was documenting of both creation and destruction. And little by little, over time of the handful of years that she was really doing this all the time, as well as teaching, um, that she, came to understand the larger forces at work, which she became better and better at describing very, very briefly in these factual passages in her
mm,
books. You can see her perspective get broader. And I think that, the movement in her books from the first one being written by someone else, Diana Belmore was sort of her concept and she was the writer, to which also was very architecture oriented, to little by little her gaining more understanding, of the larger forces at work, she became very eloquent as a writer. And so that was really, really a process. Does that,
Well,
I don't know. There was a lot of things going on in what you said, but I tried to address that.
yeah, no, that's good. Let's you said a few things that I wanted to ask you about, but I'll pull it all the way back to the beginning, which is her photographic practice. You mentioned she did learn photography at Yale,
One
but
course.
so that's what I wanted to get at,
Yeah.
which is she was primarily a painter and a graphic designer. Um, but I've seen enough of her prints at the archive, but also in exhibition over the years as well. She was a very good printer, and like,
She didn't print anything, but she had
okay,
a
see, so
very,
this is part of the question is like, w can you kind of tell us a little bit more
yeah.
about her practice as a photographer?
Yes, I think what my sense is that the first work she did of Tompkins Square Park was with a 35 millimeter camera, and
Hmm.
she very quickly after that shifted to the medium format square image. She then I can't remember the name of her camera. I'm, me, I'm not a camera person, but
Hasselblad,
it wasn't a Hasselblad. It's the cheaper version. I can't remember the name of it.
or Rolleiflex, maybe?
No. Anyway,
No?
I should have that at my fingertips. I don't anymore. But it was like a cheaper version of a Hasselblad, and my overall sense of her technique is that she wanted to she wanted to master, like she wanted to create a system. She decided on a format. She mastered that camera so that it could be an extension of her. She did not have a lot of lenses. She was, it was very no frills, sort of, I want to uh, just master the basic technique so that I'm comfortable, so that I'm not thinking about technique. And then as a printer, I mean, as in terms of her prints, she always hired printers that she
Mm,
gave very, very detailed instructions to.
mm,
Margaret was a graphic designer. She designed all of her books. She was absolutely meticulous about everything about how a book was designed and how prints were made and how they were mounted and framed. All of those, I mean, she was a formalist in the Yale sense of the term. She had a very strong sense of design and of all aspects of her work.
Well,
So,
you certainly see that in the her framing. I mean, her frames are, and I don't mean the frames around her pictures. I mean the frame of her picture is usually very formalist and very extremely well composed.
right. And how she managed, for example, to photograph the tunnel where there was complete darkness and really
Mhm.
get remarkable pictures out of that is kind of amazing. She also sweated bullets in supervising the printing of her books. I mean, every aspect of production, she was all over, but she did not work in the darkroom.
Yeah,
She,
it's interesting because I know the earlier Tompkins where we have them in the collection thanks to you actually. Um, and I know those pictures, and then I think of the pictures made in the tunnel maybe 4 or 5 years later, and yeah, you make me think like she probably technically wouldn't have been able to make those tunnel pictures in '88, but she learned because those are very technically very difficult pictures to make.
right,
Um, but she clearly learned so much in a short period of time that it's pretty remarkable. I think, you know, battle worn, late career photographers would have had a hard time making some of those pictures at that time. So, um,
I remember talking to her about some of the tunnel photographs at the time because I asked her, I said, like, well, when did you Like you were in the dark. So how did you even know what you were composing? And, because the tunnel is like you can't, you have to learn how to walk through the tunnel without like tripping over yourself. And there's rats and there's, it's scary and creepy. And she said that, she kind of guessed, and she
Mm,
used flash in the tunnel, in some of, in most of the spaces. And she didn't really know exactly what she had photographed until she got home and, made
mm,
contact sheets and looked at them. So in her process, the contact sheets were really important. And then she would choose images to make 8x10s of so that she could actually see and choose images. So the 8x10s are very much a continuation of her process. And then
mm,
from that, she would edit down to ones that she wanted to make into exhibition prints or that she finalized for reproduction. And the same is true of the interviews. She brought a little tape recorder in there and she just put it on, and then she hired a graduate student to transcribe them so they're all typed up. And then
mm,
again, the same sort of obsessive editing process, until she just, found a distillation of a passage that she wanted to include. So there's this incredible deliberateness about the process, but she wasn't concerned with doing the process. She wasn't one of those
mm.
photographers that, her identity was connected to the darkroom, quite the opposite.
Do you know, did she take back the transcriptions or the snippets she planned? I know at a certain point, she had long-term ongoing relationships with her subjects. Did she bring back those kind of edited texts and share them with any of her subjects that you know
I
of?
don't know.
Mm,
I don't know that. I mean, we still have a lot of work, to really absorb all of her papers. We do have the
mm,
transcripts. We do have the audio tapes. We do have the many revisions of each book, 'cause she kept every piece of paper.
mm.
Sort of horrible for us, but we know the process of her,
Yeah,
obsessively reworking. She gave photographs to people at the
yeah,
time when she could, when it worked out that she could find them or they were available, as many photographers in this kind of work do, that she wanted to give back. But I don't know of anything. I don't know if anything like that happened with the words. I mean, Margaret was very small and it would even strike most people as kind of frail.
yes.
And
Slight. I would
it's just,
describe her as slight.
yeah. So,
Yes.
I mean, it's just worth pausing for a moment to think about her walking around, in these places with, a camera, with valuable equipment and just,
Yeah, valuable.
creating these relationships and going time and time again, back and back to these places. I mean, it's just worth noting, um, in particular with the tunnel because, you can get stuck
Yeah,
down there and also it's in the dark. But
yeah,
just in general, I mean,
yeah.
she just did it.
Yeah, even getting into the tunnel, um, this is the old Amtrak tunnel, underneath Riverside. Um, Getting into that space was even somewhat precarious, even in those early days. Um, okay, I think I'm gonna ask one more question. Is that okay? Yeah,
That
okay.
I was
Uh,
about to say
okay.
exactly that. Perfect.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Bonnie, or just kind of put forward the question about Margaret's kind of knowledge of the the photographic tradition. Or tradition is kind of a weird way to say it, but the history of photographing the homeless in photographic history. You mentioned oh my God.
Martha Ross or
Martha, yeah,
Steve.
yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
Um, but obvi it goes back. well before that to, you mentioned Jacob Riis, and actually when you were talking about Abbott, I'm gonna put this, oh, it won't let me upload a picture in the chat. There's a photograph Bernice Abbott took of a homeless shelter on
Oh yeah, on
in
the pier.
Plenty Slip, yeah, on the pier,
Yeah.
and it looks like it could have been a Margaret Morton
It's
photograph.
Margaret's picture of Mac's house. It was very similar. Yeah.
Yeah,
He
and so
actually Abbott had a reporter with her when she took that picture. There's a whole description of that encounter,
yeah,
which is pretty interesting. But yeah.
yeah. So there's certainly that wasn't a long-term subject for Abbott, but Reese, of course, and um Lewis Hine to some extent, and I'm trying to think.
There were a lot of people in the 90s doing this kind of work. Eugene
Yeah,
Richards was photographing
yeah,
this kind of work. There was actually a lot going on, and
yeah,
it was really a subject of conversation. And I have to tell you, I mean, I was all over this because I was trying
yeah.
to, because there was a lot of attacks on Reese as being an opportunist and being, in league with law enforcement. And I was trying to
Mm,
sort this all out for myself at the time. And
mhm,
there was something about Margaret, she just, I mean, we were on this at some level, we were communicating not with words. Like we did not debate these things. It was
mhm.
very prominent in the sort of critical discussion, and she was just doing her thing, and it just didn't come up, which is weird.
Yeah, it's
There was an
interesting.
awful lot of things like that. I mean, like I say, all these things I really did not know about her, even though we felt very close to each other.
Yeah,
It was just the nature of the relationship, but I can't really answer that. She didn't have at all like an art historical turn of mind in that way. She
mhm,
like in her teaching papers were completely fascinating because it was very based on her Yale graphic design classes, and she would just bring into her students every single week, here's like every postcard for every show I ever got, or these are or clippings from the newspaper about like you got to see all these shows. She was really trying to turn her students into what she considered artists, and she wasn't interested, in the sense of like absorb everything, be open to everything, and figure out what's important to you and how you can use this material.
yeah,
So it's not that she wasn't interested. I mean, she assigned really hard readings, but they were about who an artist was, not about, she wasn't interested in the dialogue about photography per se,
yeah.
which kind of
Okay,
makes sense.
last quick question, and because I now I want your opinion, like, about where she falls in this genre, and what maybe separates her from some of the others. In my and I'll give out my opinion briefly too, is I see her work more along the lines of something like Mary Ellen Mark was doing with the Dam family, which is, um and maybe early on it was a little more distanced and was about the architecture and the things she was comfortable with. But over time it became much more about the human condition and relationships with the people, and the photographs become much more about um not just the subjects revealing themselves to Margaret, but about her relationship with the subjects, as opposed to, we I also have to be a defender of Jacob Riis to some extent at these days in my position, but his relationships with many of his subjects was much more transactional, um, and not necessarily long term. And I see a different relationship with what Margaret was doing, particularly by the 90s.
Well, first of all, I mean, just in terms of her active work I mean, I think she was very, I mean, on the one hand, she got, releases, right? That's a
Mhm.
transactional thing. Like sign this
Yeah.
release and you give me permission to use your pictures and your words. On the other
Mhm.
hand, she worked for years doing all the paperwork for about a dozen people from the tunnel to get them into housing.
Mm.
That was, and she also, knew families. When Bernard died, his family stayed with her and came up for the service, and she spoke at a service. I mean, on the other hand, she wasn't really crossing boundaries. They weren't her friends.
Mm.
But she was really trying. I mean, again, I think she was very thoughtful about maintaining dignity and respect of the people, but then when she could help, she did what she could.
Mm.
I think the most interesting thing in terms of long-standing relationships was the very fact that she did the book of the Glass House, because that came about because one of the members of that community got in touch with her like 10 years after the pictures were taken, or
Mm.
several years after, and wanted a picture. And then that started her reaching out to as many people as she could and finding
Mm.
out what happened to them. And, that just became like a whole big effort, to reestablish connections and find out the history of the people who dispersed in 1994. So I don't know that. Uh, all of these questions are really complicated. To be honest, I don't feel I'm really nailing down any of these answers, but these are the kind of issues that float around the work. In terms of her place, I haven't really thought about, I'm not writing about Margaret. That's the great thing. This is working on her is kind of what I do, in a book form or in an interpretive form. I really am trying to prepare her archive for others to interpret. So a lot of these questions I just leave floating out there. It's not my job to kind of like come up with these conclusions, or at least that's the way I've thought about it so far. But I think that at the heart of Margaret's, that quote that I read about her saying, I just did this because I had to and it changed me, is really at the core of her practice. And um, and she was a great craftsman and she showed great physical courage and all of these things. So, I mean, I just have a great, great respect for this work. I'm just thrilled that I actually do have the responsibility of keeping it in the world and hopefully helping other people learn about it because I think it's remarkable.
Bonnie, thank you so much. And Sean, I would like to open it up to questions. If anybody has any questions, Sean, is that okay with you? Did you have another
Yeah.
one or
Nope.
yeah?
Nope.
Okay,
Go.
great. If anybody has questions, you can unmute and ask directly. I'm going to ask one myself. I would be interested in finding out, Bonnie, if you are in contact with any of the people that Margaret has photographed. I remember that when I was at the talk in Brooklyn, there was one person I think who came whom she had photographed. So just curious about that.
Yes, well, Maria Prado is pictured in the tunnel as Ria, and she and Margaret reconnected. And Ria is remarkable. She's founded a social service organization. I actually went to a fundraiser for it recently, and she claims that Margaret was helped save her from she lived in the tunnel and in the Riverside Park for 20 years. So, there is that relationship. And in the course of working on the Glass House, not so much me, but Justin and Stephanie reached out to several of the people who lived there. And we have, again, it's sort of on our to-do list to send them prints and to follow up a little bit on these relationships. Um, so again, all my answers are super tentative, but we have had, we've made some contact and hopefully we'll continue to learn more.
Harvey.
Yeah, hi. That was a terrific presentation. Thank you, Barney and Sean. I'm curious about how you work forming the archive. I mean, this is a big question, maybe a little off the topic, but you're preserving her work through forming this archive, and I know it's a really hard job to do that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, and it's when so I kind of made up this idea of the temporary archive. I mean, we don't have enough money to become a foundation or be permanently installed, and nor do I have any interest in doing anything like that. But and I kind of made up the idea that we would hope, be able to create these donations, and we're getting there. We're getting some lot done. I mean, we're proud of ourselves. But Margaret literally did not throw away a piece of paper, and when we started, we had about over 200 boxes of paper that she had put together or that I had put together from her apartment that had written on them in her handwriting, sort important exclamation point. I mean, really not organized. So we've had a really, really labor intensive task of, and then of course, all of it's been really worthwhile, that once we've gotten to sort it out, but we're still working on that. And really, this is a question for Stephanie, who's our archivist and who is, I really have turned over the process of archiving to her because I'm not an archivist and she's very professional and meticulous and is always talking best practices, which I am completely clueless about. We created a database, a customized database, so that we have, as a tool to understand what we have. Um, we are Our salvation is the fact that the Archives of American Art wants her papers because to go through them and make sense of them and learn everything about her work is just what still feels slightly infinite. And the fact, since we are a temporary archive, the fact that we can deposit this somewhere. I mean, my initial thought was, oh my God, we're just going to have to put as much as we can on her website and call it a day and throw stuff out because I just didn't, where's it going to go?
Yeah.
And so we do have, you know, you know, we have this incredible opportunity with the Smithsonian, if Trump stays away from it enough, to donate her papers there. And that's just creates an incredible foundation for us
Who is the
to proceed
archivist
from
that
there.
you hired?
Stephanie Neal, she's here. She's
Stephanie, do you want to say a few
Stephanie, why don't
words
you
or?
weigh in a bit about the archival work?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie or Stephaniel. Um, yeah, I mean, I just to uh, um comment briefly. I mean, I a couple of things. I did not know Margaret personally, so it's been really profound for me to get to know her through what she saved and through her work, and how she did organize what she did and or not organize, but still saved. I think a big learning curve for me is that I hadn't worked with a collection before that hadn't been somewhat organized already, or where there was like a kind of specific focus within the collection of what I'd be working on. For instance, I was at the Mark Morris Dance Group prior to this, and most of the archive that we were focusing on had to do with the performing body of the dance group and not the whole organization. So to be working with all aspects of this collection, and finding out where to place it, what to do with it, how to activate it in the meantime has been really fun. As Bonnie has said, very organic. A lot of we've become connected to people just through having a website, and through kind of be, outreach and just being more visible. Um, and as as Bonnie mentioned, we were working with a consultant, Amina Lakhani, and uh, because I feel like, because I had been in dance world for so long, there are a lot of questions that I have, or just want to make sure that I'm doing due diligence of processing, organizing, and arranging things in a way that is going to preserve the work. And then obviously, of course, we get to work with Sean and and people for where the collections will be donated, so that we're sort of in dialogue and conversation. But that's all. I can speak more if people have more specific questions about the arrangement
That was
offline.
great, Stephanie. Thank you for saying that. I've heard Bonnie's talk before, and I learned so many new things today. So this was really great. There's
Thank you.
so much
Thank you.
information. I understand now how, vast the archive is and how much work it must be to, put it all together. I guess, will it be open for researchers eventually? Is it already open for researchers? Maybe
When
not yet.
people contact us, yes, we always help them. Yes, we've had some nice interactions. Everything the contact. Stephanie is so generous with her time and yes, people come, we learn things, they learn things. It's always possible to reach out to us just through the website, margaretmorton.org. And we'll
Wonderful.
follow
I
up.
think that, thank you, Bonnie. I think there's somebody who has a question. Somebody just unmuted.
Yes,
Yes.
that was
Hey.
me.
Okay. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. And I'm Javier González Campaña. I'm the principal of the office of Diana Balmori. And of course, I was friends of Diana and Margaret. And just like you mentioned, Bonnie, there were things that I discovered as you were presenting. She was so private, no, with her.
Yeah.
Many of the things, as you said, it was never about her. It was always about the art she was doing, no? So it was really wonderful
Right.
to hear the. Thank you so much again,
Thank
and thank
you.
you for doing this truly. And I wanted to ask you if you have been one of the books that they did, but it wasn't published. I think it was published privately, but it was the Little School. The the school they went to Argentina, where I'm from originally, and they went to the south of Argentina to visit several schools and photograph the students that were in this kind of alternative school that Diana Balmori's mother founded. And I was just curious if you had that information, but I guess I can follow up, of course.
Please follow up. I'm,
Yes.
We do.
You do, yes,
But
because that's
yeah,
an
and you
amazing,
can
and
follow
you're
up with me more about it. Yeah, we do.
definitely,
It's a
definitely.
really cool project and book. Yeah. So
which
thanks
is
for
great. We
bringing
don't
that
know
up.
that much about it. So this is great. Thank you so much because
Thank you again.
help us fill in some of what we don't know.
It
I
has been a
think
pleasure
that
to hear.
Bonnie was telling me also that, Bonnie, right, you are trying to find out more information about the exhibitions she had in Germany. Is that correct?
Yes, we want to follow. I mean, it's like one more on the to-do list, but yes, I really would like to kind of follow that up. And because I don't know, I think that I think we might be able to do something in Germany again, because I think that might be really interesting to renew the interest in her work there.
Right, exactly. Because
But
I
again,
think
we haven't, it's like on the to-do list.
Yeah, right. Okay. All right. So, Bonnie, Sean, Stephanie, thank you so much for doing this
Thank
wonderful
you.
talk. And I want to thank everybody who was here and listened and wrote into the chat. And yeah.